Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of the Sepharvaim? Have they delivered Samaria out of my hand? Who among all the gods of these lands have delivered their lands out of my hand, that the Lord should deliver Jerusalem out of my hand? Hello, everybody. This is Gilgamesh, and we are talking today about Isaiah chapter 36. As we come into this, there was a video I did just previous to this where I talked about some of the archaeology around this subject, but I also want to mention a few other things that I didn't cover in that video there. One of them is the nature of Jerusalem itself. At this point, at 701 BCE, Jerusalem has experienced explosive growth, and there are some questions among scholars as to exactly how this happened and what all the factors were, but there seems to be a growing consensus that the growth happened between 722, where the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed, and 701, when the Assyrians got to the gates of Jerusalem, that during those 2 decades there, Jerusalem had explosive growth, most likely by refugees from the north coming down into the southern kingdom, and also possibly as the Assyrians approached, that they had people from outlying areas that gathered into Jerusalem as sort of the last bastion of hope here. Still, there is dispute as to how big Jerusalem was, and most modern people have no idea how small these ancient cities were. The maximalist position, the ones who think of Jerusalem as being the largest and the grandest, estimate its population at about 25,000. The minimalists say more like 8,000. It's a bit of a gap, one 3 times as large as the other. Scholars today are generally landing more on the high end. Somewhere around 15 to 20,000 is probably what you'll hear from most people. But it is a very hard thing to estimate and very hard to evaluate with any precision how large the city was. We do have a good idea of how big of an area the city covered, and also what the water supply would have been like there, which gives us some good estimations of what's realistic in a city like that. So that's part of why the maximalist position really only goes up to about 25,000. It doesn't look like it would have been larger than that, given what we're finding in the archaeology. But this does make it very difficult to understand in relationship to the numbers that we see in the Hebrew Bible, where we talk about an army of, I assume, over 185,000 coming up against the city of merely 25,000 or 20,000 or 8,000. It had to be an overwhelming experience, but then it does make people question, is that number for the army accurate? Is that perhaps a grand retelling of the story to make it more dramatic? Would they have had any way to even estimate these numbers? How would they have known how big the army was? That would take some serious reconnaissance work to get a good grasp on it. So at best, they were probably eyeballing it. And at worst, they were probably inflating the numbers to make the miracle sound even greater. But they're not the only ones that do this. We have the Assyrians who say that they deported over 200,000 people. That also is really hard to believe if your largest city has maybe a tenth that amount. That would mean that they basically had to have emptied the entire countryside and then found more people to take with them. So most scholars believe that the numbers in the Annals of Sennacherib are also inflated. Likewise, I question some of the numbers around the amount of gold and silver that they took out of here as well. We're talking about nearly a ton. Actually, I think it's more than a ton of gold that they deport out from Jerusalem, and it seems unrealistic that a people would have that much gold in a civilization the size of theirs. And so when we look at the booty that they bring back from Jerusalem in both gold and silver, and also the amount of livestock and slaves that they bring back, all of it seems a bit overblown in the Sennacherib annals, and that isn't terribly shocking. That this was a very common thing. I don't know that anyone believed or expected these numbers were accurate numbers, they were numbers that told a good story. Nobody was really trying to fact check these kinds of things. And so we have to approach this a little bit with that mindset that this wasn't intended to be an incredibly factual account. It's intended to tell a story that they wanted to tell about how great the victory was. And so, yes, thousands become tens of thousands, and things like that happen in these stories. And so all of these numbers are probably a little bit inflated to make them grand. Now, the other thing to know about is that Hezekiah, we're going to see that he's about 14 years into his reign here when this happens. He has been a religious reformer. The previous king, King Ahaz, was not very faithful and had introduced a lot of things that Hezekiah opposed, Hezekiah being very dedicated to the traditional God of Israel. And Hezekiah, among the things that he does is he holds a grand Passover that lasts for 14 days. It was unprecedented. He also takes down what he sees as unauthorized worship. Now, we don't know how extensive this was, but it is going to play in this chapter here that he has dismantled some altars, and these were not altars to a foreign god. They were altars to the God of Israel. But they were also altars to other gods as well that may have been mixed in with these. And he also got rid of the Nehushtan, the brazen serpent that Moses set up in the wilderness for people to look on to be healed. He apparently disapproved of the way that it was being worshipped. They were burning incense to it, and he felt that this was improper. And so he goes through this reform. He reopens the doors to the temple. He cleans the temple. He reorganizes the priesthood, and he seems to some degree, have centralized some aspects of worship to Jerusalem. He did not do this completely. He shut down some external worship areas, but he did not shut down all of them. There will be another reform that comes in a bit later, almost a century later, under Josiah, that will be extreme. And in that reform, Jerusalem will become the only authorized place, and they'll make many theological changes to the religion at that point. And that is its own special topic. There is a lot of dispute between which reforms were done by Hezekiah and which were done later by Josiah, and it's very difficult to say. There are questions about a worship center at Lachish, which seems to have been destroyed around this time. But there are questions, was it destroyed by Hezekiah in a centralization effort? Was it destroyed by the Assyrians when they sacked the city? Either one is possible. There are other places in Tel Bathsheba and Tel Arad that appear to have local cultic sites, but the dating on them is disputed. Tel Arad particularly looks like it dates to after the time of Hezekiah, and therefore would more likely be part of the Josiah reforms where it was shut down. So it's complicated. But what we can say for sure is that Hezekiah had made some religious reforms, had reinvigorated the religious life of the people, had put a lot of focus and emphasis on the Jerusalem temple and the priesthood that served there, and he had reduced some of the religious practices that were happening throughout the countryside that he disapproved of. And it appears that Isaiah was all in on this. Now, in this chapter, we're going to have a confrontation here with an individual called Rabshakeh. Now, we'll get into a bit as to who this person was, but one of the interesting things is that Rabshakeh seems to know Hebrew, or Yehudit, as they call it in this chapter. He knows the language that they speak there in Jerusalem, and the question, of course, is how could he know this? And unfortunately, with no data, we really just can do nothing but make up stories ourselves. And so scholars have made up a lot of stories around how he could have known this. None of it's based on anything that we know. It's just, wouldn't this be neat if? There's actually a paper by Yigal Levine that is posted on Arizona.edu that I will give a link to that is quite interesting on this subject. The natural thought is that maybe he was someone from the northern kingdom who had been taken during that, and so he would have spoken either the same language or a very close language, or Maybe he was someone from the Judean countryside who had been taken, or maybe he was some sort of evil turncoat who welcomed their new Assyrian overlords. All of that's possible. None of it has any evidence. It's just complete guesswork. Scholars love it when they get to do complete guesswork because facts can be restraining. And, when it's a wide open field, you can make up anything you want. And that's kind of what we have here with who is this guy and why does he speak the language of Jerusalem? It would be a fascinating story to know more about, but unfortunately, there's just not any more to know about it. So let's take off here, starting in verse 1. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. Okay, this section here is a quote that starts in 2 Kings 18:13, and it's quoted here in Isaiah. It leaves out verses 14 through 16 of the 2 Kings account, which tells of Hezekiah capitulating to the Assyrians. It says, and Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria, to Lachish, saying, I have offended, return to me, that which thou puttest on me I will bear. And the king of Assyria appointed unto Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. That's a lot. And Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the king's house. At that time, Hezekiah cut off the gold from the doors of the temple of the Lord and from the pillars which Hezekiah, king of Judah, had overlaid, and gave them to the king of Assyria. So this is left out of our Isaiah account. And the question is, why? And one of the big questions is, which is the original text? Did 2 Kings borrow from Isaiah? Did Isaiah borrow from 2 Kings? They're very, very similar with a few differences, but this is one of the big ones, is the absence of these verses. Well, many scholars would put the King's account as the original, and that Isaiah left these verses out because they were embarrassing and didn't fit well with the story he wanted to tell of the defiant, righteous Hezekiah. As we mentioned, a city of 25,000 being assaulted by an army of 185,000 had to be terrifying. And it would be hard to fault Hezekiah in any way that he had to do whatever it took to preserve his people through such an incredibly overwhelming force. I just don't know that he would have had a lot of choice but to pursue peace through whatever means necessary. It'd be really hard to fault him for that. But that may be the case, that Isaiah left them out because this was embarrassing and it didn't tell the story that Isaiah wanted to tell. That's one view. The other view is that maybe the 2 Kings account is the one that is later, and it added in these details. And why would it do that? Well, one thing that scholars really like to say is it added them in because they were true, and they have to be true because they more or less are corroborated by Sennacherib's annals. Particularly the amount of gold at 30 talents is corroborated in Sennacherib's annals. The amount of silver is a little bit different in the two places, and they've come up with all sorts of reasons why that is. But the thing is, it could have easily gone the other way. If 2 Kings was written at a later time, even just a little bit later, those authors may have been aware of Sennacherib's annals and may have actually taken it from Sennacherib and put it in to the story in 2 Kings. And it might be the later account, and it, from that perspective, might not even be accurate, that they were just simply trying to justify their own history in bringing it into agreement with the history according to Assyria, in which case it very well might have been something that an editor in the exilic period added in to try and unify and corroborate the two histories so that they matched. And so they may have simply added stuff into the 2 Kings account that were not there originally. Possible. It's as possible as anything else. Again, we don't have any real data to make any judgment call on this, but that's a theory that I feel is underexplored, that the fact that the King's account and the Sennacherib annals match doesn't necessarily mean that that story is true. It does mean that there was definitely knowledge of both stories between them, but which way did it go? It very well could have been that editors during the exilic period felt that they needed to make their history match the Assyrian history, and so they simply added it in. That's one way to look at it. Now, as to which one is the original, which one's older, there are a couple of people that point to the Second Kings edition of the story as being the original, because there are a few places where it looks like Isaiah streamlines the grammar a bit, where he makes it more abbreviated. Now, this is interesting because that's not a terribly great standard to determine age. If you were to look at Emanuel Tov and his textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible, one of the principles he puts forward there is that the shorter account is usually the older one. Now, I don't necessarily hold to that either, but these are completely opposite principles, that they cannot possibly both be true, that the one that has abbreviated is the newer account, or the one that is expanded is the newer account, are complete opposites. And again, there's not really a good way to settle this. I don't consider the matter settled even a little bit on this, but by Emanuel Tov's thinking, the expansion of a story generally indicates that it is the younger version of the story, the newer version of the story with the expansions. But see, that cuts the other way as well, because there is a portion of the Isaiah story that is also expanded compared to the King's story, which tells of Hezekiah's prayer, and that's all great, and we'll get to that in a later chapter. So there really is no answer. The two stories are quite similar, but there are these two major differences, one of them being the omission of Hezekiah's submission in this one, and the inclusion of Hezekiah's prayer later on in some of the coming chapters. So we really don't know which one is the original. And even if the Isaiah is the older story, we also don't know that this was written by Isaiah. It's written third person. It may have just simply been an earlier edition of a text that would become Kings. It's hard to say. So I don't know that we need to assume that this chapter was authored by Isaiah, son of Amos, or anything like that. It is told in a style that is completely different from everything else in Isaiah, including the first half and the second half of Isaiah. This is its own special thing because it's in prose. It's not poetry. It's just pretty straightforward prose and historical storytelling, which Isaiah doesn't really do anywhere else in his entire book. So these historical chapters that we're in here are very special in that sense, that they do not match the writing style of Isaiah anywhere else. We started off here with a year here, the 14th year of the reign of King Hezekiah. We know exactly when this is happening, and the Assyrian Annals give us a nice corroboration with our dating systems. We have a good idea of when this is occurring, and we know that things have not been going well for Judah. That's Assyria has come in, they've gone through the entire countryside. The second most important city in Judah, which is Lachish, has been taken over and run by the Assyrians. All the accounts agree on that. This is a bad time, and an overwhelming army has shown up on the doorstep of Jerusalem. According to the Assyrian Annals, the imperial forces have captured 46 Judean towns. Again, this might be an exaggeration. Hard to say. We don't have destruction records in anything close to that number of towns. We do have very good corroboration of Lachish, which is where Sennacherib seems to be headquartered in this story here. That is constructed in the palace of Sennacherib. They have bas reliefs that show in detail the sacking of Lachish. He was very proud of it. And we have here in verse 2, and the king of Assyria sent the Rabshakeh from Lachish to King Hezekiah at Jerusalem with a great army. And he stood by the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the washer's field. Rabshakeh here, this word is presented in the Hebrew text without any kind of definite article as though it was a proper name, but it actually appears to be a title, probably something like head steward. In Kings, this figure is also accompanied by two other Assyrian court officials that also have titles as names. And so we're going to see in Kings these three Assyrian officials confronted by three Jerusalemite officials. And that makes a very interesting symmetry that is missing from the Isaiah text, but may have been correct. But we don't seem to get the actual names of any of these people. These seem to be titles. And so this person that is the head steward or whatever does not appear to really be a military title. He is probably along because of his language skills and the situation here, rather than because he is leading the army. So he is probably not the man in charge, but he is the one who has been appointed to speak. And they come here with a great army, and they show up at the conduit of the upper pool and the highway to the washer's field. In some translations, it'll have the fuller's field. This word, that washer or fuller, is a word that in modern Hebrew has come to mean laundromat. So they've got it about right. This is the place where they would wash clothing. And so this was an area that was a very communal practice as to how you did your laundry back then. This was the laundry spot. And this is apparently an important part of the city here, that they have gone to this area, and this is where they are going to conduct this confrontation outside the walls of the city. So we have here in verse 3, and there came out unto him Eliakim the son of Hilkiah, who was over the household, and Shebna the scribe, and Joach the son of Asaph the recorder. Okay, so we have three people here, two of which we have already met. Back in Isaiah chapter 22, Shebna was condemned, Eliakim was exalted, and now they seem to be back here. None of them have any hint of negativity in this scene, and they are joined by a third person, Joach. And we're not even really sure what their roles actually did. We have Eliakim, who seems to be the one in charge here. He was over the house. That probably means the palace, that he was somehow the chief of staff or something over the royal palace. And then we have Shebna, who is the Sofer. The scribe is how that word would often be translated, but the verb there doesn't always limit itself to just recording stories and documents. Well, I guess documents, yes, but not necessarily stories. The verb also means to count, and so he might be more of an accountant. It also is used occasionally in military senses, in that they counted and mustered the troops. So we're not sure what Shebna's role is. Is he a scholar and intellectual who writes documents? Is he a military recruiter who has a military role there? Is he somebody who's more of a financial advisor? We really don't know. There's no reason to assume that what the word comes to mean in later centuries applied to this century. So it's really hard to reflect those things back. Scribe is a fine translation that is what the word comes to mean, but we're not really sure what the duties of a scribe was at this particular time. And then we have Joach, and his word here, which is translated as the recorder, means like to call something to remembrance. He's the reminder. I could use a reminder every now and then. We're not sure what that was either. Maybe he's a historian. Maybe he is somebody who has to bring back some sort of a memorial or something. We're not sure what his role is. But these three seem to be deeply important in the political structure of Jerusalem, and they are sent out as the folks who get to walk out onto the battlefield and hope they don't get killed as they try and negotiate. And the Rabshakeh said to them, "Say to Hezekiah, thus saith the great king, the king of Assyria, what is this confidence you trust in? You say, a word of the lips as counsel, and there is valor for war. In whom do you now trust that you have rebelled against me? Behold, you are trusting on a staff, this broken reed, upon Egypt, which a man will lean on it, and it will go into his palm and pierce it. Such is the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, to all who trust in him." So this is great imagery here, that the Rabshakeh here is mocking them, asking them, why are you so confident here? You've just got words that you've put together, this crazy idea that somehow Egypt is going to save you. And he calls it a broken reed. And the word here for reed is a plant that was very popular in Egypt, still is very popular in Egypt, it grows abundantly in Egypt, are these reeds. And so he has the idea here that Egypt is this reed, but it's a broken reed. And if you're trying to use it like a staff, it's going to just cut right into your palm. You're going to get hurt by it, not saved. And so he is trying to undermine their confidence that Egypt could make a legitimate stand against Assyria. And just great imagery that he does in doing that. And he references here that Hezekiah has rebelled. Part of why they are there at Jerusalem is to put down the rebellion of Hezekiah, who has refused to pay taxes. And this is interesting because we've actually got, just very recently we found our first bit of cuneiform ever found in Jerusalem. And we believe it dates right to this time. And it appears to be a letter from Assyria warning Judah that they haven't paid their taxes. So this fits the story, and it was found right in the area called the Ophel, which is the south end of where the Temple Mount is, right in the right area, right to the right time, and written in cuneiform. So this would have been correspondence into Hezekiah telling him, hey, the bill's due, you haven't paid it. And I believe that Hezekiah responded back with a check is in the mail or something. But we have here that Hezekiah has gone to rebellion against them, and that is why this army is on the doorstep here. And we have verse 7, but if you say to me, we trust in the Lord our God, is it not he whose high places and altars Hezekiah has removed, saying to Judah and to Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar? And now make a wager with my master, the king of Assyria. I will give you 2,000 horses if you're able on your part to set riders on them. So we have a couple of interesting things here. He's using Hezekiah's reforms against him. He's saying, and not speaking to the delegation here, but he's speaking to the people of Jerusalem. He's saying here that Hezekiah has angered the God of Israel, that you used to worship the God of Israel at all of these various places. Hezekiah has said that's not legitimate, and he has taken down those altars. There is no way the God of Israel will protect you with this king here who has destroyed the altars that were built to him. So we have an idea here that he is driving a wedge between Hezekiah and the people. Now, this means that he not only knows the language of Hezekiah, but he understands the religion very deeply as well, and he understands how to try and put a wedge between the common folk religion of the people and the official state religion of the king. That Hezekiah has pushed for these certain reforms, but the common people still have different practices than that, and they're worried that what the king is doing is actually going to anger the God of Israel and therefore will not save them. Do we really trust this king and his temple and his priesthood, or do we trust our practices that we've had for generations at these other places that involved other practices that Hezekiah is now telling us are wrong? So he's pushing this wedge between what the people have traditionally believed and what the king is now leading them to believe. And he gives this very interesting brag here that we'll just give you 2,000 horses. Horses were incredibly powerful weapons of war in that day if you had enough people who knew how to ride horses. They didn't really. Their horses were not a big thing in the hill country of Jerusalem. And so, yeah, it's very unlikely they had very many people who would have been able to be used as cavalry. And so this is really interesting. Verse 9. How then can you repulse a single captain among the least of my master's servants when you trust in Egypt for chariots and for horsemen? So we have here the idea that because Jerusalem does not have a good cavalry, does not have chariots, that's why they have to go to Egypt, is because they have no real substantial army of their own. Now, NetBible, in their notes on this, had a very interesting read on these events. They have here, how can you turn back the face of an official from the least of my master's servants and trust in Egypt for chariots and horsemen? The chief advisor develops further on the argument that he began in verse 6. His reasoning seems to be as follows. In your weakened condition, you obviously need military strength. Agree to the king's term, and I will personally give you more horses than you are capable of outfitting. If I, a mere minor official, am capable of giving you such military might. Just think of what power the king has. There's no way the Egyptians can match our strength. It makes much better sense for you to deal with us. That's how Net Bible reads these verses. And I think it's a compelling argument that he's saying that I'm just a nobody and I could give you 2,000 horses. I still, though, kind of lean that this is simply a mocking, that he's saying I could give you 2,000 horses right now just so it's a more fair fight. And you're still going to lose. That because you don't even know how to fight. You're a bunch of farmers. How could you possibly stand against our trained army? That's still how I read it. But I do think that Net Bible's idea here is an interesting take on it, that if I, a lowly person, could give you 2,000, imagine how strong the king is. Coming here to verse 10, and now is it without the Lord that I have come up against this land to destroy her? The Lord said to me, go up against this land and destroy her. So now the Rabshakeh has claimed for himself communication with the God of Israel, that he is the appointed one of the God of Israel. This does seem to say that maybe he has a very close tie to these people. The idea that he is a turncoat, that he is somebody who was from the northern kingdom that maybe became prisoners and then bettered himself by allying with the Assyrians. All of that seems like a real possibility, given his wording here, that he seems to know just how to get to them. That he is saying he himself is from the Lord, that the God of Israel has actually sent him. Then Eliakim, Shebna, and Joach said to the Rabshakeh, please speak to your servants in Aramaic, for we understand it. Do not speak to us in Yehudit, in the ears of the people who are on the wall. So Aramaic had become this shared lingua franca through the area. It was the language of Syria, which was actually called Aram in Hebrew, and so Aramaic. This is the language of Syria, and it was an international language, and they apparently were trained in it and could speak it, and they would much rather have this be a more private conversation. They did not want this person harassing the people on the wall and causing them to lose heart. They know that this is bad business, and they want to control the messaging to the city. Understandable, but also understandable to the Assyrians as well, who clearly knew what they were doing when they decided to send somebody who could speak Yehudit. So this is part of their plan here. Now, I will note that Hebrew is never called Hebrew in the Hebrew Bible, that it just isn't there. It didn't become called Hebrew until quite a bit later. By the Second Temple period, you start seeing it a bit, although the term kind of flips between Aramaic and Hebrew quite a lot when you look at like the New Testament writings and that sort of stuff. But in the Hebrew Bible, the language famously here is referred to as Yehudit. There's another place where I believe it's also referred to as Yehudit. And Isaiah also, in a chapter that we went through recently, referred to it as the language of Canaan. They thought of their own language either as the language of Judah or as the language of Canaan. They didn't really think of it as Hebrew. There's no indication they called it that. But the Rabshakeh said, has my master sent me to speak these words to your master and to you, and not to the men sitting on the wall, to eat their own dung and drink their own piss with you? That's pretty much the wording of the King James Version. The word here that's translated as dung is harehim. It's going to get me demonetized, isn't it? The rabbis, apparently not feeling very comfortable reading that to the congregation, decided to swap it out with another word. And so the marginal notes, the kirei that is in the Masoretic text here, swaps it out with a more polite word, which is soatam. It means essentially the same thing, but it's apparently a more polite way to say it. And he said that they would drink shenehim. The rabbis also decided to replace that with meme reglehim, which is literally water of their feet, which was an idiomatic expression for urine. Again, a kinder, gentler way to say it. But I think something's lost here, that you need to understand that the Rabshakeh was not being polite. He was being very blunt. But you also need to understand the terror of what he's talking about. Why would he say this? because that's what happens during a siege. You cut off the water supply, you cut off the food, they don't have access to the fields, they can't bring in their crops, everyone starves to death. And yes, the scriptures themselves talk about stories of cannibalism, that it comes down to that yes, they eat dung, that they will become craved. And we see this in history throughout. Whenever people became starved and dying of thirst, humans will be driven mad with such things. And yes, they will resort to incredibly horrifying animalistic behavior because that's the way it works. We saw this with like the Donner Party moving out west, and many other examples, that normally humans that would never consider such things, when driven to madness through hunger and thirst, will do terrible things. And the people of the ancient world knew this well. They knew it very well. And they knew that's what they were facing, that they weren't going to simply have a battle and have it be over with. They were going to be starved out until they were eating each other. And that is what they faced, a horrifying death. And so he is doing this to shake their confidence. Then the Rabshakeh stood and called out in a loud voice in Yehudit, "Hear the words of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus saith the king, do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you. Do not let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord by saying the Lord will surely deliver us. This city shall not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Do not listen to Hezekiah." So we have this interesting threefold repetition here of do not Hezekiah. Do not listen to him. Do not let him deceive you. Do not let him make you trust. And interestingly, there's a paragraph marker here in the Masoretic text, which for some reason wasn't preserved in the verse divisions. And so we have the first bit of verse 16 that I actually put up here because that's the way it divides the paragraphs in the Hebrew. And I think it makes more sense with this whole speech about do not let Hezekiah do this to you. So the Rabshakeh here is doing everything he can here to undermine the king's power. And he has shifted his tactic here a little bit. He started out saying that he was commissioned by the Lord to come here and destroy this city. But now he is pointing out that no God has ever been able to stand against Assyria. And so he's flipping his tactic here a little bit as he tries to break the people's confidence. So going here, verse 16, "For thus saith the king of Assyria, make with me a blessing and come out to me. Then each one of you will eat of his own vine, and each one of his own fig tree, and each one of you will drink the water of his own cistern, until I come and take you away to a land like your own, a land of grain and new wine, a land of bread and vineyards." So a lot of things happening in this. Make a blessing with the king of Assyria is what it says literally. A lot of translations will go with, make a peace or a treaty with him. That is what it means, that they will make their peace or treaty with him. But the word here is literally a blessing. Make a blessing and come out with me. So you're entering into this covenantal relationship, really, with the king of Assyria and accepting him as your sovereign. And if you do that, he then uses very biblical language that each one of you will eat of your own vine and fig tree. So we again have the idea here of eating and drinking, and this was to be in contrast with the things they just said they were going to eat and drink. But they're going to have here their own vine and their own fig tree and their own cistern. So all the things that they're worried will be destroyed through the siege, they will still have. And then he doesn't really give them the promise that they're going to stay there. They're still going to be deported, but he puts it in these grand terms of, I'm going to take you away to this beautiful land with grain and wine and bread and vineyards. And so he's painting it as this great thing and painting it in much the same terms that the Torah talked about the land of Israel that they were going to have. And so he's going to take them away to this promised land if they just simply accept his leadership. "Beware lest Hezekiah mislead you by saying, the Lord will deliver us. Has any god of the nations delivered his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim? Have they delivered Samaria out of my hand? Who among all the gods of these lands have delivered their lands out of my hand, that the Lord should deliver Jerusalem out of my hand? So we have here this really dramatic speech here that nobody's been able to stand against Assyria. And he brings up Samaria, particularly the northern kingdom that fell. These were their kinsmen. Many of the people in that city were very likely refugees from these places that had fallen, that had come to Jerusalem looking for the last stand against this. And we have here in verse 21 something that I think tells us a lot about what's happening here. But they were silent and answered him not a word, for the king's command was, do not answer him. So as terrified as they are, and as understandable as it would be if they cried out in terror, or some of them maybe even jumped down from the wall to go join the enemy, none of that happened. They had solidarity, even though they were incredibly outnumbered, even though the terrifying aspect of slowly starving to death was right there at their gates. None of them responded back. They stood there in silence because Hezekiah, the king, had told them, don't answer them. Hezekiah had assured them that the Lord would protect them, that the way that Jerusalem was blessed by the Lord, it would not fall, and he was relying on that. Now, I do not know if Hezekiah also did everything he could to try and appease them with offering them the gold and the silver. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But the fact is, at the end of the day, Jerusalem wasn't conquered. And that seems to be the case both from the Sennacherib Annals and from the Hebrew Bible, that for whatever reason, the campaign stops suddenly and they never take Jerusalem. So it survives. Then Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, who was over the household, and Shebna, the scribe, and Joach, the son of Asaph, the recorder, came to Hezekiah with their clothes torn and told him the words of the Rabshakeh. And that's where we're going to leave it, on a cliffhanger. Will they make it through this? What will Hezekiah's response be? We'll have to find out in the coming chapters. Until next time, shalom.